podcast, and actually there are only like 10 podcasts, so I can't really brag about it too much. Okay, so what we discussed was 5 years ago were certain aspects of where podcasting was in 2011 and your beginnings. So I won't ask you too much. I'll ask a few questions about the history of podcasting per se, where you began, just to maybe cover some bases that I didn't cover back then because I was probably too nervous. We did that over Skype.
I remember, yeah.
I was probably too nervous to do that back then. I am probably still now, but I'm handling myself beautifully.
I would never know. You seem calm, collected. Yeah.
Experience. 5 years has passed.
You know?
I started as an engineer, so I was never in radio before starting podcasting. So for me, it was a completely different experience back then. For you as a actually, I can ask you, your roots were in traditional radio.
Radio, yeah.
And you still partly are in traditional radio.
Oh yeah, a big part of my...
Why did you move to podcasting as a new medium?
Well, I was already, doing, putting audio on the internet, so that wasn't anything new. The only thing that was new was, here I was doing a radio show out of Los Angeles, and we were putting every show on the internet. You could download an MP3 of it. Been doing that for a year. And a kid called me, I remember very well. He said, "Are you doing a podcast?" I said, "What's that?" "I don't know, what are you talking about?" "Oh, and he explained it was just an RSS feed of your audio. I said, "Well, I'm already doing the audio." And literally that day I was able to, and I had to make it by hand, write the XML for an RSS feed, so I had a podcast. So that was in 2004, that was in October 2004.
Really early we talked.
Yeah, I would say that was, podcasting was a month old. I mean, the genesis of podcast goes back many years before that, but kind of as we know it, the podcast feed created as an RSS feed with binary file attachments. Adam Curry had asked Dave Weiner to modify RSS to include that. I think Adam had in his mind exactly this. He wrote an early podcast client, so that all happened in the fall of 2004. So yeah, pretty early on, but it and it wasn't really until the August of the next year, or April of the next year, when we started Twit. They did the first Twit show, that I saw it as more than just another way to distribute the audio I was already distributing. Okay.
So back in 2011, you said the name podcast is something that you're willing to use begrudgingly.
Well, only because you have to use language that people understand, right? But I always thought it was
the same today.
It's clear now that isn't a very good description of what we're doing. First of all, people aren't using iPods anymore, so it doesn't even make sense, really. In the interim, Apple went after some people for using the word pod. So there was always some question whether it was really appropriate to use an Apple trademark. It isn't an Apple phenomenon as much as and Apple. It's easy to think it is, especially during the iTunes era, because Apple was the first and for many the only way that they ever listened to podcasts. So, but I really never wanted it to be tied to any one company or technology. I also thought it didn't fully describe many of the things that internet broadcasters might want to do. We do, for instance, now a 24-hour stream. It's not something you could download and put on your iPod or any other device. It's a live stream, much more like a television station on the internet. And so podcast doesn't describe that. Is that a separate activity? I always thought it was a mistake for podcasters to say they were podcasters. In this, obviously that's how you would describe it, and I still do when I talk to people. I'm a podcaster, but it's bad for you to think of yourself as a podcaster because that's really kind of limiting. Just as it would be bad to think of yourself as a blogger. If you're a blogger, you should think of yourself as a writer who uses the internet to publish your writing. If you're a podcaster, you should think of yourself as, I think broadcast is still a good word, as a broadcaster who uses the internet as your medium, not the airwaves. So I prefer the word netcast. I really liked netcast, and I really tried to get people to use it. It didn't have a brand name associated with it. It was independent. It kind of implied the idea of casting a net, which I love, the idea of casting a net and bringing in listeners. And it really also describes better what we do, which is build a community, not just kind of broadcast or monologue, but build a community. So I liked netcasts, and of course we're broadcasts on the internet, so it even made more sense. I wish that had become the name. We still say in our material we're a netcast, but the problem is nobody knows what that means. I think the word podcast will fade out, just as the word bloggers kind of faded out. People still would say things like, well, The Verge is a blog or Gadget is a blog, but does that really describe very well what those blogs are? I don't think so. They're online publications.
The meanings probably changed a lot since when blogging was invented.
Yeah, and I probably should have, in hindsight, not said, let's stop calling ourselves podcasts, let's call ourselves something else, and I lobbied for netcast. And I did that at the first or second podcast expo at the keynote in that. So that was a long time ago. And people really mocked it. I probably shouldn't have said it that way. I should have said, it's fine to call yourself a podcast, but don't think of yourself as a podcast. Think of yourself as an internet broadcaster, or somebody who uses the internet as a medium for your audio and video. That's a much better way to think of yourself, and much less demeaning and kind of ghettoizing.
Already in 2011, you stressed how important is a video to the future of, let's say, podcasting. Do you think that it's still that important?
No, I was wrong on that. So, in one regard, it was, first of all, it's so much easier, simpler, and less expensive, faster, in every way better to do audio. And it turns out your audience mostly wants audio because they can listen in the car. It's much more convenient. Sitting down and watching video requires a lot more attention, and there's not as much time to do it. So there's a lot more time to listen to audio. So even for us, and we do so much video, everything we do is in video, and high quality video too, not just kind of as an afterthought, but high quality video. And it's still only maybe, depends on the show. Some shows it's more than half of our audience, shows that are particularly visual, but most shows it's 20%, no more than a quarter or a third of our audience. Audio makes sense, gets easier. But the advantage of video, the reason we started doing video is it's sexier. And so you get more coverage, you get more attention. It's a nice adjunct because people can see you, they can imagine you in a place, they can see where you are. We built this studio, this was $1 million studio that we built. It was very expensive. And we built it for a few reasons. One, to kind of say to the world, this is not some guy in his basement. This is a business. It's got staying power. We're going to be around. Because advertisers are investing in you when they buy ads. They're assuming that you're not flighty and that you're serious about what you're doing. So yeah, we're professional. So we wanted to really establish a look and a feel to the shows and the website and everything we do that's professional. It makes it easier to get advertising, but also kind of reassures the audience. I mean, on the one hand, a lot of audiences like the informal, the Dawn and Drew, we're sitting on TV trays in our kitchen talking about life. That's great. I'm not demeaning that in any way. Many people kind of prefer that kind of podcast, and that's really to me, that's what the word podcast conveys, is a couple of guys or a couple of gals talking about personal stuff kind of without an agenda. That's a podcast to me. It's one of the reasons I don't think podcast applies necessarily to kinds of stuff many of us do. And that's fine, that's good, and that's audio, that's not video. And I was wrong I thought there'd be more uptake of video, but now I realize, of course, it's just not convenient for people. I think it's, if you can do it, I'm glad we're doing it. I'm not going to stop doing it. I've considered stopping, because it is a great expense.
Yes, the entire studio here is basically devoted to the visual elements.
Which is, for most of the audience, completely wasted. It's completely lost on them. I have to even and it's a disadvantage for us too, because I have to remind, I did this yesterday, our staff meeting, our hosts, our staff, everybody, most people are not watching. So if you show a video, you can't show it without comment. If you can't say, look at this. It's kind of second nature for me because I've worked in radio for 40 years, so I'm used to the idea. And yet, I still I forget all the time that people aren't seeing, because it's natural. I mean, you're just kind of biologically tuned to the fact that somebody's sitting across from you. And I do want our hosts, and I want to feel like I'm talking to somebody sitting across from me as opposed to some distant person in a car. So it's just, it's a challenge to do it. It's expensive. but at the same time, there's some value to it, and we'll keep doing it. The new studio we're building is much less grandiose. It's a little smaller. It doesn't have windows to the outside world. You know, we built this with a storefront, hoping that
people would
walk
walk
by and look in and stuff.
Style ABC, I think it was
Yeah,
morning shows.
yeah, the morning shows on all the networks do this, and some of the MTV shows also did it that way. And I like that idea, and I kind of had this imaginary vision that there'd be people outside waving and things, but that doesn't happen. But it does have some, it's wonderful because for me, I'm not working in a cave, and for the audience watching, they do see people walk by, they see cars drop by, and it gives them a sense of that we're in a real place. We're going to lose that. The new place is more like a traditional television studio. It's sealed in, and we'll have to kind of simulate light and windows and stuff. And I'm actually worried a little bit about me psychologically spending 8 hours a day in this cave to see how I feel.
Had to paint blue sky.
We actually are, we're faking it, but I don't know if that'll fool my body.